The memory was a scar, not a wound. The bleeding had stopped years ago, but the mark remained, a pale, twisted thing etched into the very foundation of who he had become. He could still feel the chill of the champagne flute in his hand, a cheap prop in a room that glittered with old money and casual cruelty. That night, the annual Blackwood Innovations Gala was supposed to be a glimpse into a world he aspired to. He was just a junior analyst then, a boy from the wrong side of the city with a cheap suit and big dreams, believing merit could be a key to any door. And then he met Alara Vance. Her smile was a weapon, her laughter the sound of shattering glass. When he dared to speak of his ideas for the company's future, she had drawn a circle of her sleek, smirking friends around him. "Aren't you adorable?" she had purred, her voice dripping with honeyed venom. "The help is trying to do our thinking for us." The specific words had blurred over time, but the heat in his cheeks, the way the air was sucked from his lungs, the roaring in his ears that drowned out the orchestra, that was eternal. He was not a person to her. He was a punchline. He left that night with the echo of her laughter chasing him into the rain, the embers of a furious, cold resolve already igniting in his chest. 7 years. 7 years of 80-hour weeks, of missed birthdays and silent, empty apartments, of building something from nothing. He built Ethelgard Solutions not with his father's name or wealth, but with the ghost of that humiliation as his co-founder. And now the circle was complete. The very air in his corner office was different, thin, rarefied, smelling of polished marble and absolute authority. The news had broken that morning. Ethelgard was acquiring the crumbling remains of Blackwood Innovations. His first order of business sat on his desk, a single personnel file. The photograph showed a woman still beautiful, but the arrogance in her eyes had been replaced by a desperate, hollow fear. Alara Vance. Her father was ruined, her inheritance was dust, and she was applying for a job. His company, his rules, her future, resting in the hands of the man she had once tried to erase with a laugh. The air in the grand ballroom of the Ethelston Hotel was a physical presence, thick with the cloying scent of expensive perfume and the low, self-satisfied hum of old money. It was a symphony of privilege, and Liam, standing near a towering ice sculpture that was slowly weeping onto the floor, felt every note as a vibration of pure otherness. His suit, the best he could afford on a junior analyst's salary, felt like a costume, the wool suddenly coarse and obvious against his skin. He had saved for 3 months for it, believing that looking the part was the first step to being the part. He clutched a flute of champagne he hadn't asked for, the bubbles like tiny, frantic lives popping against the glass. This, the annual Blackwood Innovations Gala, was hallowed ground. It was where futures were hinted at, where protégés were spotted, where a well-timed word to a senior VP could change the trajectory of a career. For Liam, it was a cathedral of ambition, and he was a fervent, if nervous, acolyte. He had been watching the vortex of the room's energy, a swirling eddy of silk and sharp tailoring centered around Alara Vance. She was the CEO's daughter, a fact everyone knew but no one needed to state. It was in the way people orbited her, in the way laughter seemed to crest around her presence, a wave she commanded with a flick of her wrist. She was objectively stunning. Hair the color of dark honey fell in artful waves, and her dress was a simple, devastating slash of emerald green that probably cost more than his student loan payments for a year. But it was her eyes that held him. A cool, assessing gray that seemed to catalog the worth of everyone they landed on. He saw his moment when her circle momentarily fractured, a space opening up near the bar. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs, a primal warning he chose to ignore. This was the point of coming, wasn't it? To be seen, to network, to show he was more than just a name on a cubicle farm roster. He slid into the space, offering a smile he hoped was confident, not desperate. The predictive analytics model for the Eastern European market, he began, his voice slightly tighter than he'd hoped. It's groundbreaking, but the data set is flawed. There's a cultural variable in consumer behavior it's completely missing. I've been running some side analyses. He was speaking directly to Alara, his passion for the work, for the intricate puzzle of it all, momentarily overriding his social anxiety. For a few seconds, she simply stared at him, her head tilted, a faint, unreadable smile on her lips. It wasn't a smile of recognition or interest. It was the smile of a biologist observing a new and peculiar species of insect. Then, she slowly raised a single, perfectly manicured finger. Not to shush him, but to draw a slow, deliberate circle in the air, encompassing her group of friends, a collection of trust fund heirs and socialites whose names were whispered in the society pages. The conversation around them died instantly, all attention pivoting to Liam. The hum of the ballroom seemed to recede, replaced by a ringing silence that was entirely local, entirely manufactured by her. "Everyone," she said, her voice a silken drawl that cut through the air more effectively than a shout. "Look, this is precious." Her gray eyes swept over him, from his slightly too shiny shoes to the knot of his tie, a forensic inventory of his every inadequacy. "The help has decided to grace us with its opinion." The word help landed not as an insult, but as a categorization. It placed him firmly outside the sphere of humanity she and her friends occupied. He wasn't a colleague, not a potential talent, not even a person. He was a function, a utility, a warm body that performed tasks. A hot flush crept up his neck, burning the tips of his ears. He could feel the gazes of her friends, their expressions a mixture of bored amusement and cold curiosity. He was the evening's unexpected floor show. "No, really?" she continued, taking a delicate sip of her champagne, her eyes never leaving his. "I want to hear this. Explain it to us. Explain how someone who I'm fairly sure fetched my cappuccino this morning has found the fatal flaw in $1 million system." A titter of laughter rippled through her group. It was the laughter of complicity, of shared superiority. It was the sound of a door being slammed shut. Liam's mouth went dry. The words he had been about to speak, the clever insights about regional socioeconomic data and localized marketing, turned to ash on his tongue. He was no longer an analyst. He was a specimen, pinned to a corkboard for their entertainment. He could feel the weight of his own background, the years of night classes, the student debt, the proud, working-class parents he had to lie to about how well he was really doing. All of it felt cheapened and exposed under the glare of her disdain. She wasn't just mocking his idea. She was mocking the very audacity of his presence, the sheer gall of his ambition to step out of his designated lane. The champagne flute in his hand felt impossibly heavy, a leaden weight. He could see the condensation beating on the crystal, and he had a bizarre, vivid thought that it was the ice sculpture, finally, sympathetically, melting for him. He was aware of every pore in his skin, every thread in his cheap suit, every suppressed, pitying smile from the onlookers. The moment stretched, elastic and agonizing, a public vivisection of his dignity. He didn't speak. He couldn't. He simply stood there, the heat of his shame a visible aura around him, as Alara Vance, with a final, dismissive flick of her gaze, turned her back, the conversation resuming around her as if he had never spoken, as if he had simply ceased to exist. The silence he left behind was not one of awkwardness, but of eradication. The memory did not fade. It crystallized. It became a hard, sharp, and perfect diamond of shame that he carried within him, its facets catching the light at unexpected moments, blinding him with the intensity of that singular humiliation. The first few days were the worst. Returning to his cubicle was like walking back into a crime scene. Every glance from a colleague, whether sympathetic or curious, felt like a fresh indictment. The whispered words, the help, echoed in the sterile, recycled air of the office, a ghost in the machine of his daily life. He could no longer look at the senior executives, the men in their bespoke suits, without seeing the faint, patronizing smiles of Alara's friends. The company he had once seen as a vessel for his ambition was now revealed as a gilded cage, its walls built not of opportunity, but of hierarchy and a cruel, unassailable privilege. The very mission statements on the walls, the slogans about meritocracy and innovation, felt like a sick joke, the ink itself mocking him. He understood then that his hard work, his late nights, his clever models were not currency in this world. They were just the expected output of the machinery, and he was a replaceable, nameless cog. The anger that came was not a hot, cleansing fire, but something colder, denser, and far more durable. It was the slow, inexorable creep of glacial ice, a monumental force that promised to reshape the landscape of his entire future. He gave his 2 weeks' notice with a quiet, unnerving calm that unsettled his direct supervisor. There were no dramatics, no fiery speech. He offered only the blandest of corporate platitudes, pursuing other opportunities, a chance for personal growth. He packed his few personal effects, a cheap desk plant, a faded photo of his parents, his dog-eared notebooks filled with ideas that were now tainted by their association with this place, into a single cardboard box. Walking out of the Blackwood Innovations Tower for the last time, the box felt absurdly light in his arms, as if it held the hollowed-out shell of his former self. He did not look back at the reflective glass monolith. He went home to his small, Spartan apartment, the silence there a stark contrast to the constant hum of the office. It was in that silence that the real work began. He opened a fresh notebook, its blank pages a terrifying and exhilarating void. At the top of the first page, he did not write a business plan or a company name. He wrote a single, stark sentence, a vow etched not in ink but in resolve: never again. The following years were a montage of exhaustion and obsession, a blur of stolen time and relentless focus. He lived on a diet of cheap coffee, instant noodles, and his own simmering fury. His apartment became a war room, the walls papered with flowcharts, market analyses, and schematics for a platform that would not just compete with Blackwood, but render their entire approach obsolete. He saw the flaw Alara had so casually mocked not as a weakness in his idea, but as the key to a greater truth. The old guard was blind. They were so insulated, so convinced of their own superiority, that they could not see the nuanced realities of the global market. They saw data points, he saw people. His initial capital was a pittance scraped together from maxed-out credit cards and a small, hesitant loan from his aging father, who handed over his life savings with a look of profound worry that Liam used as further fuel. He spent his days working a soulless contract job to pay the bare minimum on his bills and his nights and weekends building his empire from the ground up. Sleep was a luxury he could not afford, a thief of time. He would often wake at his desk, his cheeks stuck to a printed spreadsheet, the ghost of Alara's laugh pulling him from a fitful doze. He learned to code not from a place of academic interest, but from sheer, brutal necessity. He taught himself the intricate dance of investor pitches, his first attempts clumsy and fraught with the nervous energy of his past humiliation. He was rejected time and again. Venture capitalists looked at his worn-out shoes, his intense, almost feverish eyes, and heard the lingering trace of his unpolished accent, and they passed. They chose safer bets, smoother operators from better schools. Each rejection was a small echo of that night at the gala, a door being closed in his face. But where that initial humiliation had paralyzed him, these new ones only hardened him. He learned to absorb the no's and use them to fortify his resolve. He refined his pitch, sanding away any vestige of desperation, until it was a thing of sharp, undeniable logic and terrifying potential. He found his first angel investor not in a polished boardroom, but in a gritty tech incubator, a self-made man who saw the same feral glint in Liam's eye that he'd once possessed himself. The launch of Ethelgard Solutions was not a grand event. It was a quiet, digital flicker in a vast and noisy universe. The first year was a desperate scramble for clients, a hand-to-hand combat in the trenches of the market. Every small victory, a single contract with a struggling startup, a positive review from a niche blog, was a brick laid in the foundation of his new reality. He hired his first employee, a brilliant, cynical programmer who didn't care about his background, only about the elegance of his code. Then another and another. He built a team not of pedigreed elites, but of the overlooked, the underestimated, the fiercely talented who, like him, had been told they didn't belong. He fostered a culture of relentless execution and meritocratic ruthlessness, where the best idea won, regardless of whose mouth it came from. The cold anger that had driven him began to transmute, slowly, into a white-hot focus, a clarity of purpose that was awe-inspiring and slightly terrifying to witness. He was no longer building a company just for success. He was building a monument to the power of a grudge, a citadel designed to withstand the very forces that had once sought to crush him. The memory of the ballroom was no longer a source of debilitating pain, but the bedrock upon which everything stood. It was the origin story he never told anyone, the secret engine of his ascent, the silent, scornful partner who sat in on every negotiation and stared down every doubt. He was not just climbing the ladder. He was building a new one, and with every rung he forged, the face of Alara Vance, frozen in that moment of casual cruelty, receded further into the distance, becoming not his tormentor, but the architect of his own invincible will. The ascent of Ethelgard was not a gentle climb. It was a tectonic shift, a silent, seismic upheaval that occurred deep beneath the placid surface of the industry. While Blackwood Innovations rested on its laurels, polishing its legacy and hosting its annual galas in the same opulent ballroom, Liam's company was a predator evolving in the dark. It moved with a speed and agility that the older, bloated corporation could not comprehend. It was not built on tradition or name, but on a ruthless, data-driven efficiency and an almost prescient understanding of the market's next breath. Liam's initial insight, the one for which he had been so publicly shamed, the critical importance of the nuanced human variable, became the cornerstone of Ethelgard's entire philosophy. Their algorithms didn't just crunch numbers. They devoured cultural contexts, social trends, and unspoken consumer desires, predicting shifts with an accuracy that bordered on clairvoyance. One by one, Blackwood's most prized clients, lured by the siren song of superior results and leaner operational costs, quietly defected. The whispers started first in the financial blogs, then in the mainstream press. Ethelgard was the future. Blackwood was a beautiful, crumbling museum piece. Liam watched it all from his command center, an office that was the antithesis of Blackwood's old-world opulence. It was a space of cool, minimalist precision, all brushed steel, panoramic glass, and the soft, purposeful glow of multiple monitors. There were no ice sculptures here, only the relentless flow of information. He tracked Blackwood's decline not with the glee of a vengeful victor, but with the cold, analytical focus of a surgeon monitoring a failing organ. He saw their desperate, belated attempts to innovate, their clumsy forays into the very territories he had already conquered. They were playing checkers while he had mastered three-dimensional chess. The news of their first quarterly loss was a blip on his screen. The second was a trend. The third sparked the analyst downgrades, and the fourth began the death spiral. He knew the anatomy of a corporate collapse intimately. He had studied it, reverse-engineered it, and now he was witnessing it in real time, happening to the very institution that had once been his universe. He felt no pity. Pity was a luxury afforded to those who could afford to forget, and he had built his life around the necessity of remembering. The day the acquisition offer was formally drafted, a profound and eerie stillness settled over him. He stood at his window, looking down at the city that sprawled like a circuit board of infinite possibility. The document, a sleek digital file, was more than a business transaction. It was a verdict. It was the final, logical conclusion of a path set in motion years ago by a single, cruel moment. He thought of Mr. Vance, the titan who had presided over that gala, a man whose gaze had never once fallen upon a junior analyst. He would be old now, his empire turning to sand in his hands. He thought of the board members, the VPs, all the faces in that glittering crowd who had been complicit in his erasure through their silent amusement or their indifference. And he thought of her, Alara, the final, glittering piece of the puzzle. He did not sign the offer with a flourish of triumph. He pressed his digital signature with the calm, irrevocable finality of a judge passing a sentence. The war was over. He had not just won. He had acquired the battlefield. The news broke like a thunderclap. Industry titans were stunned. Financial channels scrambled for experts to explain how a 7-year-old company could so decisively swallow a legacy giant. At Ethelgard, there was a buzz of exhilarated disbelief. For his employees, it was the ultimate validation of their hard work, a David and Goliath story for the digital age. For Liam, walking into the Blackwood Innovations headquarters for the first time as its new owner was an experience of surreal, almost dissociative clarity. The lobby was exactly as he remembered it, vast, marbled, echoing with a hollow prestige. The same security guards were there, older, their eyes widening with a flicker of confused recognition before snapping into respectful deference. The air still smelled the same, of lemon-scented polish and ambition, but now it was his air. He walked through the cubicle farms where he had once toiled invisibly, and now whispers trailed in his wake like a wake. He saw the fear in people's eyes, the desperate hope that they would be deemed necessary in the coming call. He took the private elevator, the one he had never been allowed to use, to the executive floor. The chairman's office, Vance's old sanctum, was a monument to a bygone era. Dark, heavy wood, framed accolades, a bar cart of crystal decanters. Felt like a tomb. He did not sit in the high-backed leather chair. Not yet. He stood before the panoramic window, the same view Vance had enjoyed for decades, now his to command. His assistant, a sharp, unflappable woman who knew only the man he was now, not the boy he had been, entered quietly and placed a single, thin folder on the vast, empty desk. "The first wave of personnel reviews for your direct sign-off, sir," she said. "As requested, we've prioritized the former executive tier and their immediate families." Liam nodded, his back still to her. When the door clicked shut, he turned. The room was silent save for the low hum of the climate control. He walked to the desk, his footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rug. He opened the folder. The top document was a standard HR form, a photograph clipped to the corner. It was her. The honey-colored hair was pulled back into a severe, professional knot. The emerald eyes, once so bright with mocking laughter, were now shadowed with a desperate anxiety that no photo could fully conceal. The application was for a mid-level marketing position, a role several rungs below what her name would have once commanded. The resume was a patchwork of short-lived, likely sinecure roles that had evaporated along with her father's fortune. She was just another number now, another supplicant in the kingdom he had built from the ashes of her scorn. He slowly lowered himself into the chairman's chair. The leather groaned, accepting his weight, the sound echoing the shifting of an entire world. He steepled his fingers, his gaze fixed on the photograph of the woman who had defined the before, and who now, utterly unaware, was waiting for his judgment in the after. The air in the antechamber was chilled, sterile, and silent as a tomb. Elara Vance sat on the edge of a sleek, modern chair, her posture so rigid it felt as if her spine might fuse into a single, unyielding rod of marble. She clutched a single, expensive leather portfolio, a relic from a different life, its smooth surface offering no comfort. The room was a study in minimalist intimidation, all sharp angles and muted grays, a stark contrast to the opulent, warm-toned waiting areas of her father's era. Every detail, from the silent, efficient assistant who had ushered her in without a flicker of recognition to the abstract art on the walls that seemed to deconstruct form and function, screamed of a new order, a cold, meritocratic world where her name was now a liability, not a key. She had practiced her answers in the mirror, her reflection a pale, strained imitation of the woman she used to be. She had smoothed her voice of its old, habitual condescension, sanded down the edges of her entitlement until she hoped only a bland, capable professionalism remained. But sitting here, under the unblinking eye of a discreet security camera, she felt the facade cracking. This was not an interview. It was an inquisition, and the ghost of her every past sin was the unseen panel. The door to the inner office opened without a sound, and the assistant appeared. "Mr. Thorne will see you now." The name was a hammer blow to a bruise she had carried for years. Thorne. Liam Thorne. She had heard the whispers, of course. Everyone had. The wunderkind, the disruptor, the boy from nothing who had built an empire out of silicon and spite. She had dismissed it, tucked it away in a corner of her mind labeled unpleasant coincidences, refusing to draw the direct line from the gala to the corporate obituary of her family's company. To walk into this room and have the abstract made concrete, to have the specter given a name and a face, was a terror she had not allowed herself to fully conceive. She rose, her legs feeling foreign and unsteady, and crossed the threshold. The office was vast, a corner airy with walls of glass that offered a dizzying, God's-eye view of the city. It was breathtaking and utterly soulless, a command center for a conqueror. And there, silhouetted against the immense panorama, stood Liam. He did not turn as she entered. He was simply a dark, defined shape against the sprawling urban canvas, a figure of immense, quiet power. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the faint, distant hum of the city below. He was making her wait, forcing her to stand in the center of that immense room, exposed and uncertain, just as he had been forced to stand in the center of that laughing circle. The memory washed over her, vivid and sickening. The cheap suit, the desperate hope in his eyes, the way her words had sliced the air. She had felt so powerful then, so brilliantly, cruelly witty. Now, she felt the cold weight of every syllable she had uttered. Finally, slowly, he turned. The years had been kind to him, not in a soft way, but in a way that spoke of relentless pressure forging something hard and sharp. The boyish softness was gone, replaced by a lean, disciplined intensity. His eyes, which she remembered as being bright with naive ambition, were now the color of a winter sea, calm, deep, and utterly unreadable. He wore a simple, exquisitely tailored dark suit, no tie, the casual authority of a man who no longer needed to signal his status. He did not smile. He did not offer a hand. He simply looked at her, his gaze a physical weight that traveled from her carefully styled hair to her sensible, interview-appropriate pumps, performing the same inventory she had once performed on him, but with an infinitely more devastating silence. "Alara Vance," he said. His voice was low, measured, devoid of any discernible emotion. It was the voice of a man reading from a ledger. "Please sit." He gestured to a single chair positioned directly in front of the monolithic desk, a slab of polished stone that seemed to be an extension of the city itself. She sat, her portfolio resting on her knees like a shield. He moved to his chair and sat, steepling his fingers, his eyes never leaving her face. The power dynamic was so absolute, so perfectly inverted, that it was a physical ache in the room. He was the king on his throne, and she was the supplicant. "Your resume is interesting," he began, tapping a single finger on the printed copy before him. He didn't look at it. A series of short-term consultancies. Director of Social Outreach at the Vance Family Foundation. A curious patchwork of experiences. He didn't say sinecures. He didn't say nepotism. He didn't have to. The words hung in the air between them, unsaid but deafening. "Tell me, Ms. Vance," he continued, leaning forward slightly, the movement minimal yet predatory. "Why Ethelgard? We are a company known for our relentless culture. We prize results, not pedigree. We have no time for the old ways of doing things. What is it you believe you can offer us?" The question was a trap, baited with her entire past. Any claim of special insight, any invocation of her name would be suicide. Any attempt to leverage her father's legacy would be an admission of her own emptiness. She had to sell herself as a worker, a grunt, and the sheer, humiliating absurdity of it threatened to choke her. She began to speak, her voice tighter than she intended, reciting the rehearsed lines about her transferable skills, her understanding of high-net-worth clientele, her strategic vision. The words felt hollow, pathetic, like offering a thimble of water to a man who owned the ocean. He listened, his expression never changing, a mask of polite, detached interest that was more insulting than open contempt. When she finished, the silence returned, more profound than before. He let it stretch, let her squirm in it, let her feel the full, crushing weight of her predicament. Then, he picked up a different pen, a heavy, silver one, and toyed with it absently. "I recall a conversation we had once, Ms. Vance," he said, his tone conversational, almost casual, yet every word was a precisely aimed dart. "Years ago, at a Blackwood gala, you were speaking about the flaws in ambition, I believe, about people who overreach their station." He looked directly at her then, and for the first time, She saw a flicker of something in those winter sea eyes. Not anger, not hatred, but a cold, infinite understanding. You made a rather vivid impression. I've often thought about that night. It was a valuable lesson in corporate dynamics. He paused, letting the reference settle, allowing her to feel the full, horrifying realization that he remembered every second, that this entire empire was, in part, a monument to that single moment of her cruelty. It taught me the importance of ensuring that every single person in this organization understands the value of the work, that no one feels their contribution is beneath them or above them. He placed the pen down with a soft, definitive click. The position you've applied for is demanding. It requires grit, resilience. It is not glamorous. It is about building from the ground up. Do you believe you have that in you, Ms. Vance? To start from the very bottom and to earn your place. The question was the entire interview, the entire past 7 years, distilled into one sentence. He was not just asking if she could do the job. He was asking if she could survive the justice. The silence that followed his question was not merely an absence of sound. It was a substance, heavy and viscous, filling the vast office and pressing in on Alara from all sides. She could feel the weight of his gaze, the unblinking focus of a predator who has cornered its prey and is now deciding, not if it will eat, but how. Her rehearsed answers, her carefully constructed facade of professional competence, had shattered against the rocks of his quiet, devastating reference to the gala. He remembered. Of course, he remembered. This was not a coincidence, not a twist of corporate fate. This was a reckoning, meticulously planned and coldly executed. She saw her own reflection, pale and small, in the dark surface of his desk. The woman in that reflection was a stranger, a supplicant, stripped of her armor, her name now a brand of shame rather than privilege. The old her, the girl from the ballroom, would have flushed with indignation, would have stood and delivered a cutting remark before storming out, preserving the shattered pieces of her pride. But that girl was a ghost. The woman who sat here now understood the brutal arithmetic of survival. Her father's fortune was gone. The safety net of her name had been cut. This man, this Liam Thorne who had been forged in the fire of her own cruelty, held her entire future in the palm of his hand. To walk away was to embrace a freefall into obscurity and financial ruin. To stay, to answer, was to accept a sentence. She lifted her chin, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in the muscle of her jaw. The emerald eyes that had once sparkled with mockery were now dark pools of hard-won clarity. "I understand," she said, her voice low but clear, stripped of its old melodic condescension. It was the voice of someone who had finally run out of options. "I am prepared to earn my place." The words tasted like ash, but she did not look away from him. She held his gaze, accepting the terms of her surrender. A ghost of a smile, devoid of any warmth, touched Liam's lips. It was not an expression of triumph, but of confirmation. This was the final piece of the puzzle falling into place. Outright firing her would have been too easy, too quick. It would have been an act of pure vengeance, a momentary satisfaction that would have ultimately diminished him, reducing him to the level of her past pettiness. This was something else entirely, something far more profound and punishing. This was justice not as a blunt instrument but as a surgical blade. He picked up the silver pen again, its cool metal a familiar anchor in the storm of his own emotions. The furious boy from the gala screamed for a more visceral, crushing victory. But the man, the king in this glass castle he had built, saw a more perfect, more devastating path. He would not destroy her. He would remake her. He would force her to walk, day after day, through the world she had once held in such contempt. He would make her a citizen of the realm she had believed was only for the help. "The role in the Market Analytics Division is an entry-level position," he stated, his tone returning to that of a dispassionate CEO. "It is a foundational role. You will be responsible for data purification, source verification, and the generation of preliminary reports. You will not be developing strategy. You will be providing the raw materials upon which others will build. You will report to Sasha Bellingham, a team lead who started in this company as an intern and who, I assure you, has no patience for pedigree or excuses. The hours are long. The work is meticulous. It is, as I said, not glamorous. But it is the bedrock of everything we do here at Ethelgard. He watched her, searching for a flicker of the old arrogance, a hint of disgust at the prospect of such grunt work. He saw none. He saw only a terrifying, hollowed-out resolve. It was, in its own way, more satisfying than any tantrum could have been. He slid a single sheet of paper, a standard offer letter, across the vast expanse of the desk. The salary listed was a fraction of what she had ever earned, a sum that would barely cover the rent on a modest apartment in a neighborhood she would have once avoided. The job title was bland and anonymous. There were no bonuses, no stock options, no perks. It was a document of pure, unadulterated toil. The offer is contingent on a 6-month probationary period, he added, his voice flat. Your performance will be evaluated with the same rigorous metrics applied to every other employee in that department. There will be no special considerations. This was the core of his design. By offering her the job, he was taking possession of her humiliation, making it a permanent, daily feature of her life. By making her acceptance of its terms voluntary, he was making her complicit in her own sentence. She would have to wake up every morning and choose to walk back into the world he now controlled. She would have to sit at a small desk, in a sea of cubicles, and perform tasks she would have once deemed beneath her, for a manager who was her professional inferior in every way but merit. She would have to prove her worth in the very system she had mocked, and she would have to do it from the very bottom. Elara's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the pen he offered. The cool, heavy weight of it felt like a brand. For a heartbeat, she hesitated, her fingers hovering over the signature line. This was the point of no return. Signing this paper was an act of self-annihilation, the final death of Elara Vance, the CEO's daughter. What would be born in her place was unknown, a creature of struggle and survival. She glanced up at him one last time. His expression was inscrutable, a mask of pure executive judgment. There was no pity there, no malice, only an immense, unassailable authority. She took a breath that felt like her first true one in years, and pressed the pen to the paper. The scratch of the silver nib was deafening in the silence, the final, soft click of a lock turning. She had signed her name not to a job offer, but to a contract with fate, a pact that bound her to the man she had created and to the long, arduous road of atonement that now lay unforgivingly ahead.